The system watches everyone. Every movement, every decision, every pattern. But some people don't fit the pattern. And when the system can't predict someone, it starts watching them even more closely. The message should have disappeared when I closed the laptop. That's what messages normally do. You read them, you shut the screen, and the world returns to its usual shape. But this one didn't. Even after the screen went dark, the words stayed with me. Behavioral monitoring active. Unpredictable pattern detected. Observation continues. I stood by the window of my apartment for a long time that night, looking down at the city and trying to convince myself that the message didn't really mean anything. Cities run on systems. Transit systems, traffic systems, navigation systems. Each one analyzing enormous streams of data every second. One person behaving slightly differently shouldn't matter. But the longer I stood there, the harder that explanation became to believe. Because the system hadn't simply flagged unusual behavior, it had identified a pattern. And patterns only appear when separate actions begin connecting in ways the system didn't expect. I tried to retrace these actions in my mind. The first one had been small, almost accidental. The night the train stopped in the tunnel. The moment the man stood up and walked out through the doors while everyone else stayed seated. At the time, it had felt like nothing more than a strange interruption in the rhythm of the city. Now it felt like the beginning of something. The second moment had come later. Standing at the crosswalk, watching a man step into the street while the signal was still red. Then the others. The cyclist ignoring the reroute, the passenger boarding a bus, despite the advisory message. Each moment small enough to ignore. Each one barely visible within the millions of decisions happening across the city every hour. But when I started mapping them, they formed clusters, patterns, and now the system had noticed those patterns too, which meant something had changed. Before, the system had been observing behavior. Now it was observing someone observing behavior. Me. I turned away from the window and walked back to the desk. The laptop remained closed where I had left it. For a moment I hesitated, because opening it meant confirming something I wasn't sure I wanted confirmed. If the system had been monitoring my behavior, then the map might look different now. Not just clusters, not just deviations, something else, another layer. The thought stayed with me long enough that I almost decided not to open the computer at all. Almost. But curiosity is a difficult instinct to suppress, especially once you start noticing the edges of something larger than yourself. I lifted the lid slowly. The screen woke immediately. The map filled the display again. For a moment, nothing looked different. Clusters still glowing across the city. The faint arc of behavioral deviation stretching through the districts I had been watching, exactly the way it had looked the night before. I leaned closer to the screen, scanning the map slowly, looking for anything new, anything the system might have added after detecting the pattern in my behavior. At first, I didn't see it. The change was subtle, small enough that I almost missed it entirely. Near the edge of one cluster, a faint marker flickered into view. Not the same color as the refusal points I had been logging, not the same shape either. This one was dimmer, almost gray. For a moment I assumed it was just a rendering artifact. Maps sometimes produce strange visual errors when too many data layers overlap. But when I moved the cursor across the screen, the marker reacted. A small timestamp appeared beside it. 3 hours earlier. I frowned slightly and zoomed in. The marker remained, still faint, still gray, but now another one appeared nearby, then another. They weren't scattered randomly across the city. They appeared only near the clusters, just outside the areas where behavioral deviations had been strongest, like observers standing at the edge of the same invisible boundary I had been mapping. The realization came slowly. These markers weren't refusals, they were people. Individual movement patterns the system had flagged as something different. Not violations, not anomalies, something else. I hovered the cursor over one of them again. Another timestamp appeared. Late the previous night. Another marker showed a time from early that morning. They appeared briefly, then disappeared, which meant the system had lost track of them shortly after detecting them. That shouldn't have been possible. The city's infrastructure tracked almost everything: transit cards, navigation routes, mobile devices, camera models estimating pedestrian flow. People didn't simply vanish from that network of information, not unless they knew exactly where the network's blind spots were. A strange thought crossed my mind. The man from the subway platform, the one who had stepped off the train, the one who had said he was already outside the system. I searched the map for the subway station where we had met. For a moment, nothing appeared. Then, just as I began to zoom out again, a faint gray marker flickered near the platform entrance. A timestamp appeared beside it. 20 minutes after I had left the station, which meant he had remained there after our conversation ended, watching something, or perhaps waiting. I leaned back slowly in the chair. The city outside my window continued its quiet routine, traffic lights shifting through their cycles, trains sliding through tunnels beneath the streets, digital advisory messages appearing and disappearing on screens across the districts. Everything functioning exactly the way it always had. But now the map on my screen suggested something I hadn't considered before. The clusters weren't the only pattern forming in the city. There were other people watching them too. People who moved through those areas in ways the system struggled to predict. People who appeared briefly in the data, then disappeared again. Not many, maybe a dozen across the entire map, but enough to form a pattern of their own. And the longer I looked at the faint gray markers blinking around the clusters, the more a quiet suspicion formed in my mind. The system wasn't just studying refusal anymore. It was studying the people who had begun to notice it, which meant something important. The moment someone becomes aware of a system guiding behavior, they stop behaving like the system expects. And once that happens, the system has two choices: adapt to the observer, or eliminate the unpredictability they create. I sat there staring at the map for a long time, watching the faint markers appear and disappear along the edges of the clusters. Not random, not coordinated, but clearly connected by something the system hadn't fully modeled yet. And slowly, another realization settled in. The message from the note before had said unpredictable pattern detected. At the time, I assumed it meant my own behavior, but now the map suggested something else. Maybe the pattern wasn't just me. Maybe the system had discovered something larger, something forming quietly beneath the surface of the city. A small group of people beginning to see the same invisible structure. People who had started asking the same dangerous question, not how to follow the system, but how to move where the system couldn't see them. And if that was true, then somewhere in the city tonight, others might already be looking at the same map I was. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there staring at the faint gray markers scattered around the clusters on my screen. They were subtle, easy to miss, unless you were looking directly at them. But now that I had noticed them, they felt impossible to ignore, because the clusters had always represented something simple. Moments when people ignored the system, small refusals. But these markers meant something very different. They weren't moments, they were individuals. Which meant the system wasn't just recording deviations anymore. It was tracking the people who caused them, or at least trying to. I zoomed in closer on the first gray marker. The timestamp still hovered beside it, 3 hours earlier. There was no additional information, no identifier, no device signature, just the faint outline of a person-shaped movement pattern appearing briefly within the data and then fading away. Almost like the system had detected someone and then lost them again. I moved the cursor to another marker, 7 hours earlier, another cluster edge, another brief appearance, another disappearance. Each one lasted only a few minutes, then the trail vanished. I sat back slowly, because that shouldn't have been possible. The city's infrastructure was built around persistent tracking, not surveillance in the traditional sense. Nothing dramatic like cameras following individual faces through the streets. But the network still observed patterns continuously. Phones transmitted signals, transit cards logged entry and exit points, navigation apps shared route adjustments. Even pedestrian flow could be estimated by analyzing the movement of thousands of small data points at once. When someone moved through the city, the system didn't need to know exactly who they were, it just needed to know where they were going, which meant the system almost never lost track of movement entirely, except here. Here the system had detected someone and then lost the trail completely, and it had happened more than once. I zoomed the map out again and counted the gray markers carefully. 1, 3, 5, 8, 10, 12. They were scattered across the city, but they followed the same general arc as the clusters, just outside the areas where behavioral refusals had been strongest. As if these individuals were standing at the edge of the same invisible boundary I had been mapping the night before, watching it, testing it, or perhaps learning from it. I felt a strange sensation building in my chest as I stared at the screen. Not fear, something closer to recognition, because the behavior of those markers looked oddly familiar. They appeared briefly, observed something, then moved away before the system could establish a stable pattern, which was exactly how I had been behaving over the past few days, moving through the city, watching clusters, recording small refusals. And now the system had flagged my own behavior as unpredictable. The thought settled over me slowly. If the system had detected me, then these markers might represent other people who had started doing the same thing. Other observers, people who had begun noticing the same structure I had, which meant the man on the subway platform might not have been the only one. I leaned closer to the laptop again, scrolling through the timestamps attached to the markers. They weren't evenly spaced. Some appeared late at night, others during the middle of the afternoon. One had occurred just after sunrise, but the spacing between them felt intentional. No two markers appeared in the same place at the same time, which meant whoever these people were, they were careful. Careful not to overlap, careful not to create patterns the system could easily detect. And that was when I noticed something else. One of the markers looked slightly different from the others. The shape was the same, the color the same dim gray, but when I hovered the cursor over it, a small label appeared beneath the timestamp. 2 words, short, almost technical. Node 17. I frowned slightly, because that was the first marker that had a label at all. The others had nothing, just timestamps, but this one had been assigned an identifier, Node 17. The words stayed on the screen for a few seconds before fading away again. I stared at the place where it had appeared, because the system had chosen a very specific word, not subject, not anomaly, node, which implied structure, connectivity, a network. And suddenly the gray markers looked different, not isolated individuals, points within a system, or perhaps points within something the system had begun to model. A quiet thought formed in the back of my mind. What if these people weren't just observers? What if the system had already realized they were connected somehow, not directly, not communicating, but influencing the same behavioral patterns across the city? The clusters expanded, the gray nodes appeared near them, then disappeared again, almost like people studying the edges of a living structure, testing how far it could stretch. I leaned back in the chair again and glanced toward the window. The city outside looked exactly the same as it always had. Cars moving through intersections, pedestrians crossing streets under the glow of streetlights, trains sliding through underground tunnels beneath the districts. Everything calm, everything orderly. But now I knew something most people walking those streets didn't. The system wasn't the only thing mapping behavior anymore. Somewhere in the city there were others watching the same patterns. People the system could see, but couldn't fully understand. People who appeared briefly in its models and then vanished before the prediction stabilized. And the longer I looked at the faint gray markers surrounding the clusters on the map, the more another possibility began to form. Maybe the system hadn't just discovered them. Maybe it had been trying to understand them for a long time, which would explain something else. The label, Node 17, numbers usually imply sequence, which meant there might have been 16 others before it, or perhaps 16 the system had already lost track of completely. I looked back at the map again. 12 markers, only one labeled, but the label had revealed something important. The system wasn't ignoring these people, it was studying them, trying to determine how they moved through the city without triggering predictable behavior. Trying to understand how someone could exist within the network and still slip outside its model. And slowly another thought settled into place. If the system had labeled one of them Node 17, then eventually it might assign another label, another number, another observer appearing within the pattern. And if my behavior continued to diverge from the system's predictions, that number might be assigned sooner than I expected. I stared at the map again, watching the gray markers flicker faintly around the clusters. 12 visible, 1 labeled, several appearing and disappearing within the last 24 hours. But the longer I watched them, the more a quiet certainty grew in my mind. The system wasn't the only one mapping this network. Somewhere in the city tonight, the people represented by those gray nodes might already be looking for each other. And if that happened, the system would notice immediately, because systems are very good at detecting patterns, but they're even better at detecting cooperation. For a long time, I kept the cursor hovering over the place where the label had appeared. Node 17. The words had faded from the screen after a few seconds, but the memory of them stayed sharp in my mind. Because labels change the meaning of things. A gray marker by itself could be anything. A glitch, an unclassified event. But once the system assigns a label, the object stops being accidental. It becomes part of a structure, and structures imply organization. I zoomed the map in again, returning to the subway station where the marker had appeared. The platform entrance sat quietly on the screen, surrounded by the faint glow of nearby clusters. Nothing unusual at first glance. Just another location where the city's invisible behavioral patterns had started to shift. But the timestamp beside the marker told a different story. 20 minutes after I had left the station, which meant the man had stayed there after our conversation ended. Long enough for the system to detect him. Long enough to be identified as something worth labeling. The thought made the room feel slightly colder, because the system had called him Node 17, and numbers rarely start at 17. I leaned back slowly in the chair, trying to picture the sequence that must have come before that label. Node 1, Node 2, Node 3, people who had appeared in the system's behavioral models and then slipped beyond its predictions. People whose movements the algorithms couldn't stabilize into reliable patterns, which meant the system had already been watching individuals like this for some time. Maybe months, maybe longer. The gray markers blinking across my screen suddenly looked less like new discoveries and more like fragments of a much older observation. I scrolled through the timestamps again. Some of the markers dated back nearly 48 hours. Others had appeared only minutes before I opened the map. But one detail remained consistent across all of them. Every node appeared close to a behavioral cluster, never inside, always near the edge, which meant they weren't the source of the refusals. They were observers, studying the same boundaries I had been mapping. And if the system had already labeled one of them Node 17, then it had almost certainly labeled the others too. Just not on the layer of the map I was currently seeing. I began searching the interface more carefully, opening small menus along the edge of the display, looking for additional filters, additional data layers. If the system had created a category for nodes, then somewhere in the interface, there had to be a way to visualize them. The menus responded slowly. Most of them contained nothing useful. Transit overlays, traffic density models, pedestrian flow simulations, all the usual analytical tools the system used to maintain stability across the city. Then one tab caught my attention. It didn't have a label, just a small icon I hadn't noticed before, a thin circle intersected by several faint points. I clicked it. For a moment nothing happened. Then the map flickered, the clusters dimmed slightly, and the gray markers brightened. More of them appeared, not 12, not even 20. Dozens. They blinked faintly across the city, like distant stars emerging in a dark sky. My breath caught slightly as the pattern expanded, because the nodes weren't scattered randomly. They followed the same arc I had been mapping since the night before, a curved line stretching across several districts, almost like a fault line running beneath the city. But the nodes weren't evenly spaced. Some areas had 3 or 4 close together, others had none at all, which suggested something interesting. These people weren't coordinating their movements. If they had been, the spacing would look deliberate. Instead, the pattern looked organic. Independent observers drawn to the same unstable boundary, watching the same shifting edges in the system's behavior. I hovered the cursor over another marker. This one had a label too. Node 11. Another, Node 22. Another, Node 4. The numbers varied wildly, which meant something unexpected. The system hadn't discovered these people in sequence. It had discovered them gradually, over time, possibly over months, each node representing someone whose behavior had diverged from the model strongly enough to require separate tracking. I sat there silently for a moment, letting the scale of it settle in, because this wasn't just a handful of unpredictable individuals. This was a category, a class of people the system had identified but couldn't fully predict. Observers, outliers, variables, and now the system had started watching them carefully. Which raised a question that made my stomach tighten slightly. If the system had already labeled more than 20 nodes, then how many were there in total? I hovered the cursor over the legend in the corner of the map. A small indicator appeared. Tracked nodes 24. I stared at the number. 24. Across an entire city. 24 people, whose behavior had become difficult enough to model that the system had created a separate category just to track them. It was an oddly small number, considering the millions of people living in the city. But at the same time it was larger than I expected, because it meant something important. I wasn't the only one who had started noticing the system. The man on the platform wasn't alone either. There were others, dozens of them, moving quietly through the same districts, studying the same behavioral boundaries, testing the same invisible edges, and if the system had created a category for them, then the system must have already reached a conclusion about what they represented. Not yet, but something close. I hovered the cursor over node 17 again. The marker pulsed softly. Then another piece of information appeared beneath the label. A small statistical indicator. Prediction stability, 32%. I frowned slightly, because that number was unusually low. Prediction stability measured how accurately the system could anticipate someone's behavior based on past data. For most people in the city, the stability score would be extremely high, 90% or more, which allowed the system to guide traffic, transit, and navigation smoothly. But Node 17's score was barely above 30, meaning the system could barely predict what he would do next. I moved the cursor to another node. Prediction stability 41%. Another. Prediction stability 27%. Each one different, each one unstable, and suddenly the meaning of the nodes became clear. The system wasn't tracking them because they were breaking rules. It was tracking them because they were difficult to model, difficult to predict, which meant something important. These people weren't just observing the system, they were behaving in ways the system couldn't easily understand. And once a predictive system encounters too many variables it can't model, it starts adjusting its strategy, not to eliminate the variables, but to study them more closely. I leaned back slowly and glanced again toward the window. The city lights stretched out in every direction, a million quiet routines unfolding beneath the surface of the night, most of them perfectly predictable, but somewhere out there, 24 people were moving through the city in ways the system struggled to understand. And now the system had started measuring them, mapping them, studying their decisions, which meant the nodes weren't invisible to the system at all. Not really. They were something much more interesting. They were the system's most valuable data. And the more the system studied those nodes, the more it would learn about the only thing it still struggled to predict. For several minutes, I didn't touch the keyboard. The map glowed quietly in the dark apartment while the small constellation of nodes flickered across the screen. 24 of them, spread across the city like faint stars, each one representing a person the system struggled to predict. It was a strangely small number. Out of millions of people moving through the streets every day, only 24 had diverged far enough from the model to be tracked separately, which meant something about them was unusual, not dramatic, not illegal, just difficult to calculate. I leaned forward again and hovered the cursor over another node. Node 11, prediction stability 39%. Another, Node 22, prediction stability 34%. The numbers changed slightly from one node to the next, but they all shared the same pattern. none of them were predictable, which meant the system had stopped treating them like ordinary behavioral data. It had started studying them as a category. I zoomed the map out slowly. At first, the nodes looked scattered across the city. But the more I studied their positions, the more something about the pattern began to stand out. They weren't random. They followed the same arc as the clusters, that curved line of behavioral deviation running through the city, almost like observers positioned along a boundary, watching it move. I remembered something the man on the platform had said: small refusals are healthy. They reveal weaknesses. At the time, I assumed he meant weaknesses in the system's control, but now I wondered if he meant something else. Weaknesses in the model. Places where prediction became unstable. Places where the system's understanding of human behavior started to blur. Because that was exactly where the nodes appeared, near those edges, not inside the clusters, not causing the deviations, just close enough to observe them. I scrolled through the timestamps again. Each node appeared briefly in the data, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for half an hour. Then the trail disappeared, which meant the system could detect them, but couldn't maintain a stable model long enough to track them continuously, almost like trying to follow someone walking through fog. You see them clearly for a moment, then the outline fades again. I leaned back in the chair and looked away from the screen. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the laptop's cooling fan. Outside the window, the city moved through its normal rhythms. Cars passing through intersections, pedestrians crossing sidewalks, the quiet pulse of a system guiding millions of small decisions every hour. But now I knew something about that system most people didn't. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. It worked because most human behavior followed patterns, routine, habit, predictable choices shaped by invisible guidance. But once someone became aware of that guidance, their behavior changed. Not dramatically, just enough to break the model, which meant awareness itself was the variable the system struggled to predict. And the nodes on the map represented people who had crossed that threshold, people who had started seeing the system. The thought made me glance back at the screen again, because the nodes weren't evenly distributed. Several appeared near the subway lines, a few near major intersections, others near the quieter edges of the districts, which meant they weren't gathering. They weren't meeting, at least not in any obvious way, but something about their movements still felt connected. I began overlaying the timestamps on top of the cluster data. 1 hour, 2 hours, 6 hours. The clusters expanded slowly as small refusals appeared across the city, and shortly afterward, a node would appear nearby, not immediately, not dramatically, just long enough for the system to notice them before they disappeared again. It looked almost like a rhythm. Clusters forming, nodes appearing, then silence. The pattern repeated several times across different districts, which suggested something I hadn't considered before. Maybe the nodes weren't just observing the clusters. Maybe they were studying the system's reaction to them, testing how the system responded when behavioral variance increased, testing how quickly the algorithms adjusted their models, testing the boundaries. I sat there quietly, letting that idea settle, because if that was true, then the nodes weren't random observers at all. They were researchers, not formally, not in any organized sense, just people who had started asking the same questions I had, watching the same invisible structure, trying to understand how it worked. And the more they learned, the harder they became for the system to predict. I hovered the cursor over node 17 again. Prediction stability, 32%. Still one of the lowest scores on the map, which meant the man on the platform had probably been studying the system for a long time, long enough that his behavior no longer followed the patterns the model expected. And suddenly something else occurred to me. The system wasn't trying to eliminate the nodes. If it had wanted to do that, it could easily have increased guidance around them, more notifications, more delays, more subtle pressure to steer their behavior back toward predictability. But the system hadn't done that. Instead, it had created a category, tracked them, measured their prediction stability, which meant the system had decided they were worth studying, and that raised an unsettling possibility. The nodes weren't just anomalies, they were experiments, variables the system was observing carefully to improve its model. I leaned forward again and studied the map more closely, all moving independently, all watching the same shifting boundary between predictable and unpredictable behavior. And now the system was watching them in return, which meant two different kinds of observation were happening across the city. The nodes studying the system studying the nodes, neither side fully understanding the other yet, but both learning, adapting, refining their models. And suddenly something about the pattern felt different, because if two systems start studying each other long enough, the relationship eventually changes. Observation becomes interaction, interaction becomes influence, and influence becomes something much harder to control. I closed my eyes for a moment and imagined those 24 people moving through the city tonight, walking through subway stations, crossing intersections, standing quietly near the edges of the clusters, watching the same invisible architecture I had started noticing only days earlier. None of them knowing exactly who the others were, but all of them studying the same thing, a system guiding the city. And the more I thought about it, the more a quiet certainty formed in my mind. The nodes were to network yet, not really, but they were close, because once two observers studying the same system become aware of each other, the structure changes, not gradually, suddenly. And when that moment arrived, the system would detect it immediately, because predictive systems are very good at identifying cooperation, especially when cooperation forms in places where it wasn't supposed to exist. I opened my eyes again and looked back at the map. The nodes flickered faintly along the arc of clusters. 24 observers scattered across the city, each one still behaving independently, for now. But somewhere out there tonight, two of those nodes might eventually cross paths, and when that happened, the system would see something it had never seen before. Not refusal, not deviation, something far more difficult to model. For a long time, I watched the map without touching anything. The nodes flickered faintly along the arc of clusters like distant lights across the city. 24 of them. Each one moving independently. Each one appearing briefly near the same shifting boundary between predictable and unpredictable behavior. At first, the pattern seemed simple. Clusters formed, nodes appeared nearby. Then the system adjusted. Traffic guidance changed. Transit messages increased. Navigation suggestions shifted slightly. The cluster faded. The node disappeared. Then the pattern repeated somewhere else. It looked almost mechanical, like a cycle. But the longer I watched it unfold across the map, the more something about it began to bother me. Because cycles imply timing, and timing implies awareness. I opened the timeline overlay and began scrubbing slowly through the past 24 hours of activity. Clusters appeared one by one across the districts. Small moments of refusal, a pedestrian ignoring a signal, a driver taking a restricted street, a transit passenger stepping off a route earlier than recommended. Individually, the events were tiny, barely noticeable within the millions of decisions happening across the city. But the system had flagged them, grouped them, mapped them, clusters. And shortly afterward, a node appeared nearby, sometimes 10 minutes later, sometimes 30, sometimes almost immediately, but always close enough that the connection felt deliberate. I zoomed the map out further and let the timeline continue playing, clusters expanding slowly, nodes appearing near them, then disappearing again before the system could stabilize their behavioral model. The sequence repeated over and over again across different districts, and suddenly something about the pattern became obvious. The nodes weren't just observing the clusters, they were studying the system's response to them, watching how the network reacted when human behavior diverged from prediction, watching the adjustments, the delays, the subtle changes in guidance messages, testing how quickly the system corrected the deviation. I paused the timeline and leaned back in my chair, because the pattern looked strangely familiar, not like resistance, not like rebellion, something quieter, something more analytical. It looked like experimentation. Clusters appeared, nodes observed, the system reacted, then the nodes moved somewhere else, testing another boundary, another weakness in the predictive model, And the more I thought about it, the more something else became clear. The nodes weren't coordinating these observations, at least not intentionally. Their movements didn't align. Their timing varied. Some appeared during the day, others late at night, but they were still studying the same structure, which meant they were learning the same lessons independently. Where its predictions weakened, where guidance intensified, and slowly another realization settled into place. Learning changes behavior. Once someone understands the edges of a system, they start moving differently within it, more carefully, more deliberately, which makes them even harder to predict. And that meant the nodes weren't just observers anymore. They were evolving variables within the system's model, variables that influence the clusters themselves. I returned to the map and overlaid the node positions on top of the cluster data. The result made my stomach tighten slightly, because the nodes formed a loose perimeter around the arc of behavioral deviation, not evenly spaced, but clearly positioned along the boundary, almost like observers surrounding a moving line, watching the places where the system struggled to maintain control. The clusters expanded, the nodes shifted, then the system adapted, the cycle repeated, and suddenly the relationship between them became clear. The nodes weren't just studying the system, they were indirectly shaping it. Every time they observed a cluster and moved on, the system adjusted its predictive model, refining how it responded to behavioral variance, learning from the interaction, which meant the system was evolving too, adapting to the presence of observers it couldn't fully predict. I stared at the map for a long time after that realization, because what I was looking at wasn't just a city anymore, it was two different forms of intelligence studying each other. Human awareness and algorithmic prediction, both adapting, both learning, neither side completely in control of the outcome. I glanced toward the window again. The city lights stretched across the skyline in every direction, millions of quiet routines unfolding beneath the surface of the night, most of them predictable. But somewhere out there, 24 people were moving through the city with a different kind of awareness, watching the same invisible architecture I had started noticing only days earlier, studying the same behavioral edges, testing the same boundaries, and slowly, without realizing it, forming a pattern together, a structure the system had already begun mapping, which meant the nodes weren't invisible to the system at all. They were something much more valuable. They were the system's most important experiment, because by studying the nodes, the system could learn something it had never fully understood before. What happens when humans become aware of the model guiding their behavior? I looked back at the screen again. 24 nodes flickering faintly across the city, each one still moving independently, still studying the system from different angles, but the pattern between them was already visible. Not a network, not yet, and the moment those observers began interacting with each other, the system would detect it instantly, because predictive systems are built to recognize patterns. But cooperation is a very different kind of pattern. It changes faster, it spreads unpredictably, and once cooperation forms inside a system designed to guide individual behavior, the model begins to fail. Not immediately, but gradually. Prediction becomes unstable, guidance becomes less effective. The system starts adjusting faster and faster, trying to stabilize something that no longer behaves the way it expects. And suddenly another thought settled quietly into place. The nodes weren't the only ones studying the system. The system was studying what would happen when the nodes eventually found each other, which meant the moment two of them met, the experiment would change. And if that happened, the city might begin to behave in ways the system had never modeled before. Not refusal, not deviation, something much harder to predict. Awareness spreading from one person to another. And once awareness begins spreading, no predictive system can control how far it goes. For several minutes after that realization, I didn't move. The map glowed quietly in the darkness of the apartment, while the nodes continued flickering across the city. 24 of them, each one appearing briefly near the clusters before disappearing again. Each one representing someone the system struggled to predict. And somewhere inside the same model, the system was studying them, studying us, trying to understand how awareness changes behavior. I leaned closer to the screen again and resumed the timeline playback. Clusters formed, nodes appeared, then the system adjusted, The rhythm repeated across different districts like a slow, silent conversation between two observers who couldn't quite see each other. But as the timeline reached the present moment, something unusual happened. A new marker appeared, not far away. At first I assumed it was just another node appearing near one of the nearby clusters. But when I zoomed in, the location felt strangely familiar. The marker pulsed faintly on the screen, a gray point just 2 blocks from my apartment. I stared at it for a long moment before realizing why the location looked familiar. Because it was my neighborhood. The timestamp appeared beside the marker, 2 minutes ago, which meant whoever it represented had appeared in the system's model almost immediately. Then another piece of information faded into view beneath it. A label, Node 15. The marker remained perfectly still, not moving through the streets the way most nodes did when they briefly intersected with the clusters, just waiting. I leaned back slowly in the chair, because that wasn't how the nodes usually behaved. They appeared, observed, then moved away before the system could stabilize the prediction. But this one hadn't moved at all, which meant the system was currently watching someone standing very close to where I was sitting. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Outside the window, the city continued its steady rhythm. Cars passing through intersections, pedestrians crossing sidewalks beneath the streetlights. But now the map suggested something different. One of the observers had come closer than any node before, close enough that the distance between us was visible on the screen, 2 blocks. The marker pulsed faintly again, then the prediction stability indicator appeared beneath the label. Prediction stability, 29%, one of the lowest scores I had seen, which meant the system had almost no reliable model for predicting what this person would do next. I stared at the marker for a long moment. Then another thought occurred to me. If the system had detected Node 15 standing 2 blocks away, then it had also detected something else, me, because my own behavior had already been flagged as unpredictable, which meant the system might already be calculating the possibility of interaction between the two of us. The thought made my chest tighten slightly. Predictive systems work by modeling relationships between variables, and if 2 unpredictable variables move too close together, the model has to account for the interaction, which meant the system was probably watching this moment very carefully, watching to see whether the 2 patterns would intersect, watching to see what happened next. I hovered the cursor over the marker again. The label flickered briefly, then another line of information appeared beneath it, a small statistical field, interaction probability, increasing. I stared at the words for several seconds before realizing what they meant. The system wasn't just tracking the nodes individually, it was modeling the possibility that they might encounter each other, which meant something about this moment was already part of its experiment. The nodes observing the system observing the nodes, and now the system observing what would happen when 2 observers crossed paths. I looked away from the laptop and toward the window again. The street below looked ordinary, quiet, the way city streets always look late at night. But now I knew something the people walking down there didn't. One of the observers was standing somewhere among them, close enough that the system had already predicted the possibility of interaction. The marker on the map pulsed again, still in the same place, still waiting, and slowly another realization settled in. The node wasn't moving because it had already reached its destination, me. I closed the laptop slowly. The screen went dark, but the location of the marker stayed clear in my mind, 2 blocks away, at the corner where the streetlight flickered above the small convenience store that never seemed to close. I stood up and grabbed my coat. For a moment I hesitated near the door, because stepping outside meant something important. The moment 2 nodes interacted, the pattern would change, not just for us, for the system. But curiosity has a way of overpowering hesitation, especially once you realize you're part of the experiment. I stepped outside into the cool night air. The city looked exactly the same as it always had. Traffic lights cycling through their patterns, cars gliding through intersections, pedestrians moving quietly along the sidewalks. Everything normal, everything predictable. Except now I knew that somewhere just ahead, One of the people the system struggled to understand was waiting, watching the same invisible structure I had been studying. I walked the 2 blocks slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving through the quiet streets the way anyone else might. And when I reached the corner, I saw the figure standing beneath the streetlight. She looked up as I approached, not surprised, almost as if she had been expecting me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The street remained quiet around us. Then she smiled slightly. "You're Daniel," she said. I stopped walking. "How do you know that?" She glanced briefly toward the dark city around us. "Because once someone starts mapping the system," she said softly, "the system maps them back." The words hung in the air between us for a moment. Then she added something that made the entire city feel different. "There are more of us now," she said. "More nodes?" She shook her head slowly. "Not nodes." Her eyes moved briefly toward the skyline before returning to mine. "Observers." A passing car moved through the intersection behind us, headlights sweeping across the pavement for a moment, before disappearing again. When the street returned to silence, she spoke one last time. "The system predicted refusal," she said, "but it never predicted cooperation." For a moment the city felt very different, not a network guiding millions of people through predictable patterns, but a place where something new had started forming quietly beneath the surface. Awareness, and as the woman turned and began walking down the empty street, she glanced back once. "You should come with me," she said, "before the system realizes we've already started finding each other."